Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. The vanishing at Sandbridge Beach, despite the mild temperatures that had brought thousands of families to the more sedate Sandbridge neighborhood of Virginia Beach from Memorial Day weekend in 2019. The sea air carried an unsettling chill. What ought to have been an idyllic beach day would quickly turn into one of the most unsettling mysteries in the history of the area. The local Coast Guard is still troubled by this occurrence, which has left an entire community challenging their preconceived notions about their serene coastline. Swimming was something Sarah Chen had always been quite good at. The 28-year-old Old Dominion University graduate student studying marine biology spent most of her leisure time in the water, learning about the ecosystem she was passionate about. In order to get water samples for her thesis on microplastic pollution, she informed her roommate that Saturday morning that she was going to Sandbridge Beach. She brought her bright orange safety buoy, which she always trailed behind her when swimming alone, along with her standard equipment, waterproof collection containers, a GPS unit, and her phone in a waterproof case. At around 9 a.m., Sarah arrived at a reasonably packed beach. A number of families had already reserved spaces close to the lifeguard posts, but Sarah continued south past the main pool to the point where the beach curved away from the houses. This was where she liked to do her research. The water was usually clearer, and her samples were less contaminated when there were less people around. 10:47 a.m. Sarah went into the water, based on the GPS data from her phone that was later found. She was observed swimming systematically in a grid pattern by several witnesses, pausing sometimes to gather samples. About 200 yards offshore, her orange buoy was visible from shore, bobbing steadily. The sea was perfect, excellent visibility, moderate winds, and calm waves. Then an impossibility occurred. Around 11:15 a.m., beachgoers observed that Sarah's orange buoy was no longer moving. For several minutes, it drifted still in the same place. No one was immediately alarmed, but a few people made comments about it. When the buoy started to move toward shore without someone attached, panic broke out. Even though researchers frequently remained in one spot for long stretches of time. At 11:23 a.m., the first 911 call was received. Lifeguards from Virginia Beach were racing jet skis toward the deserted buoy at 11:30. What they discovered was inexplicable. Sarah's apparatus remained safely affixed to the buoy, along with her GPS unit and weatherproof sample bags. Sarah was not there, but her phone was in its case, fastened to the buoy's leash. Within minutes, the Coast Guard began a huge search. Boats patrolled the coastline, and helicopters swept it. The season broadening search trends. The circumstances were still ideal for a search. There were no hazardous currents nearby. Visibility was good, and the water remained calm. The buoy was discovered on the ocean floor below, which was searched by divers. Nothing. The total lack of any distress signal added to the unease surrounding Sarah's abduction. There were no messages or emergency calls on her phone. She had been moving properly up until 11:15 a.m., according to the GPS device, when everything just stopped moving. There were no indications of contacts with marine life, no indication that she had attempted to remove any of her gear, and no signs of struggle with it. Over 400 square miles of ocean were searched over the course of 6 days. Aircraft, volunteer boats, and Coast Guard vessels were searched continuously. It was one of the biggest operations in the recent history of the area. They couldn't find anything other than that orange buoy drifting empty in wonderfully calm waters. There was no sign of Sarah Chen, no clothes, no personal belongings. More concerning information surfaced as the investigation progressed. Sarah was seen entering the ocean, routinely in the security footage from neighboring seaside residences, but the cameras weren't set up to record the spots where she vanished. Nonetheless, a number of witnesses offered dependable testimonies that further exacerbated the enigma. The Hendersons, a Norfolk family, had been observing Sarah through binoculars since their son, 12, had a fascination with marine biology. Investigators were informed by Henderson that Sarah seemed to be swimming normally until she abruptly stopped and appeared to be treading water as she gazed out into the ocean. She stayed still in the water for nearly 30 seconds, as though she was captivated by something beneath the surface. Then Sarah just slipped under the water, without any visible fight or distress, Mrs. Henderson said. She didn't squirm or cry out for assistance. Detectives were informed by Mrs. Henderson. She simply collapsed as if being gently pushed down. I had never seen something so bizarre. This story was confirmed by Marcus Webb, a teenage surfer who had been around 150 yards away. Since Sarah was the only swimmer in that area of the beach, he claimed to have noticed her. Sarah had been swimming as she always did when she stopped abruptly and seemed to be looking down into the water. According to Webb, her stance appeared motionless, as if she were under some sort of hypnotic influence, he said. The NOAA subsequently conducted an analysis of the oceanographic conditions that day. The water was comfortable for swimming at 72 F. No or anomalous currents, riptides, or seismic activity that could have caused undersea disturbances were detected. About 35 feet was the depth at which Sarah vanished. Deep within her the ability to swim, although marine biologists looked for potentially harmful marine animals, they couldn't find any signs of shark activity nearby. Plankton and marine microbe levels in the water samples Sarah had taken that morning and recovered from her equipment were within normal limits. An expert swimmer would not have been threatened by anything in the water. When Sarah's study notes were reviewed, the investigation took an even more bizarre turn. Although microplastic contamination had been the subject of her thesis, she had started recording odd findings in her study journal in the weeks before her disappearance. In the deeper ocean near Sandbridge Beach, she described odd light patterns and unusual water hue. According to her notes, she observed well-organized marine life that didn't fit the norm for behavior in school. 3 days prior to her disappearance, one note stated, "The fish behavior is also unusual, and the water seems different here. There's something about the way light penetrates at the 30 feet depth that doesn't match normal optical properties." These observations weren't part of Sarah's original thesis focus. Dr. Michael Torres, Sarah's study advisor, informed investigators because they seemed to be avoiding certain areas entirely, creating these perfect circles of empty water. He had assumed they were merely aberrations in her data collecting, but she had mentioned them to him in passing. In retrospect, he acknowledged that her actions throughout the last few weeks appeared to have changed. Even though she had a ton of data from other places, she had been going back to that particular section of Sandbridge Beach more and more. When it was discovered that Sarah's disappearance wasn't wholly unusual, the case garnered national media attention. According to local Coast Guard records, the same approximate location of Sandbridge Beach has seen for additional instances of a similar nature in the previous 15 years. In each instance, skilled swimmers simply disappeared in calm weather, leaving behind floating gear, but no sign of the individual. In 2012, David, a Navy SEAL trainee, Rodriguez had vanished while swimming in open sea. Like Sarah's, his training buoy was discovered drifting empty. During a training swim in 2016, triathlete Jennifer Walsh disappeared, leaving behind her water bottle and timing watch that were fastened to her safety float. In every case, their seas were calm, the weather was clear, and the swimmers were much better than typical. The Coast Guard started surreptitiously keeping a closer eye on the area, since the trend was so unsettling. Although they increased patrol frequency and placed more cameras, they insisted in public that the instances were random coincidences. Locals started talking about their own eerie encounters. Beachgoers reported discovering personal belongings and shoes washed ashore on the coast with no justification. Even those who were typically careful swimmers reported experiencing an overwhelming want to get into the water in that particular place. Carl Donnelly, a retired fisherman, told reporters that he had been staying away from that area of the ocean for years because his fish finder kept giving him readings that were implausible. Big masses something showed up and vanished without warning. After 2 weeks, the hunt for Sarah Chen was formally cancelled, but her case was still pending. The FBI looked into the possibility of foul play for a short time, but they were unable to find any indication of human participation. Criminal activity appeared improbable because there were no threats, ransom requests, or personal enemies. The fact that Sarah drowned was not accepted by her family. They provided large rewards for information and engaged private investigators. Her parents, who were both doctors, found it incomprehensible that a skilled swimmer should disappear so totally under such benign circumstances. They hired a third party to examine the water samples Sarah had combed, searching for a hint as to what had captured her interest in those last minutes. The outcomes were disturbing. The concentrations of bioluminescent microorganisms, beings that generate their own light in the water samples, were abnormally high. Although they posed no threat to people, their large numbers were unusual given the season and the area. Although scientists were unable to explain why these species would congregate in that particular location, marine biologists believed that some sort of environmental shift might have produced conditions that were beneficial to them. The case grew more complex 2 months after Sarah vanished. About 3 miles offshore from Sandbridge Beach, a commercial fishing trawler retrieved nets that contained Sarah's, one of her study containers, and a waterproof watch. Marine vegetation, which usually took months to accumulate, covered the objects, but they had only been gone for 8 weeks. The state of the watch was even more unsettling. The time was off by precisely 47 minutes, but it was still running. The finding site was located far from Sarah's disappearance, in water that was more than 200 feet deep. The weight of the watch and the way it was made to stay afloat made it impossible for ocean current models to explain how her personal belongings had gotten there. The case is still unresolved 4 years later. Coast Guard has set up local lifeguards, and additional monitoring equipment are in place to keep a closer eye on swimmers who wander into the deeper water of Sandbridge Beach. Marine biologists across have examined Sarah's study notes, but her observations regarding peculiar water conditions and the behavior of marine animals are still unaccounted for. The actual seashore seems just as it always has: excellent beach, rolling waves, and surf-loving families. However, people who are familiar with the story find themselves paying closer attention to the water, especially where Sarah Chen made her last remarks. Some tourists claim to have seen odd light patterns dancing in the depths on calm days when the water is clear and the sun shines deep beneath the surface. It was just what Sarah had described in her last study notes. Everyone who knew Sarah is plagued by the same question. In those final seconds, what did she witness that caused her to pause swimming and gaze into the water? Even more concerning, what is hidden beneath Sandbridge Beach's surface that can cause seasoned swimmers to disappear completely, leaving just floating gear and unsolved mysteries in their wake? Although the ocean preserves its secrets, residents claim that on extremely calm days, you can occasionally still make out the orange buoy bobbing in the distance, serving as a reminder of the mystery that lies beneath the seas to the sound beneath. Myrtle Beach Jake Morrison initially believed the sound to be the typical roar of waves hitting the pier. The time was 3:47 a.m. Jake was working his overnight shift as a maintenance technician at the Myrtle Beach Ski Heel on a Tuesday in September 2021. In the darkness before dawn, the enormous 187-foot Ferris wheel remained silent. Its vibrant LED lights faded to a gentle blue radiance that hardly showed on the deserted beachfront below. After 8 months of working the night shift, Jake had become used to working alone. He was able to study for his engineering degree because of the job's good pay and the peaceful hours. However, something was different that evening. He was checking the wheelbase mechanisms, as usual, when he heard it. A resonant, deep humming that simultaneously seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere. Jake had never heard a sound like that before. It was neither the organic beat of the waves in the ocean or the mechanical drone of machines. There was more to this, completely, a profound, nearly melodic tremor that appeared to pulsate through the earth. The buzzing intensified, as though the earth were singing, as he pushed his ear to the sky wheel's concrete foundation. Jake's initial thought was to check the wheel motors, but everything was working as it should, for precisely 11 minutes. The sound continued, and then disappeared as enigmatic as it had started. More curious than worried, he recorded the time in his maintenance notebook. He was unaware that this was only the start of something that would soon frighten a whole seaside town. Jake started to hear the sound more often throughout the course of the following few weeks. Every time it happened between 3 quark and 4 ku. It usually seemed to come from somewhere far below the beach and lasted precisely 11 minutes. It was hard to focus on anything else because of the mesmerizing nature of the humming. In these episodes, Jake discovered he stood still and listened, carefully, as though the sound were attempting to convey a significant message. Were it not until the night of October 15th, when everything changed, the phenomenon might have remained Jake's personal secret. Jake made the decision to look into it more that night. He had a little seismograph app on his phone and a digital recorder with him in the hopes of gather some proof of what he was going through. 3:47 a.m. Just as planned, the humming started, but this time Jake saw something that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't only the sound beneath the skywell, it was emotion. From north to south, the vibrations appeared to follow the coastline in a purposeful pattern along the beach. As the sensation shifted beneath his feet like some enormous, invisible creature swimming across the sand itself, Jake gazed in amazement and increasing alarm the app for seismographs on his during the episode. The phone went crazy, recording vibrations that had nothing to do with any recognized geological activity. The scans revealed a steady rhythmic pattern that was nearly natural. The following morning, Jake listened to his audio recording and found something that caused him to doubt his own sanity. The buzzing held what sounded nearly like a language, a complicated collection of tones. The first person Jake shared his experiences with was Michelle, his girlfriend. Jake hoped she would have a scientific explanation for what he was hearing. Because she was a student at Coastal Carolina University studying marine biology, Michelle became increasingly interested in his recordings, especially the rich tone patterns in the humming sound. "This is incredible," she said, informed him following an analysis of the audio files. "I think you've found something entirely new, Jake. The wavelengths are all off, but the frequency patterns are compatible with whale song. Whales don't make noises at these frequencies, and definitely not from underground." Michelle's interest prompted Jake to start recording his experiences more methodically, and he found that the humming happened every night, at the same time, for precisely 11 minutes, and that it seemed to be strongest close to the beach access points and pier structures, indicating that it came from somewhere offshore before moving under the sand. A seismologist from the University of South Carolina, Dr. Elena Vasquez, agreed to come to Myrtle Beach and study the phenomenon. The word of Jake's discovery spread among the local scientific community. She brought specialized equipment and installed monitoring stations along a 2-mile stretch of beach. The results of Dr. Vasquez's investigation were both fascinating and extremely unsettling. The seismic readings verified that something was, in fact, moving beneath the beach during the humming episodes, and the vibrations started from about 200 feet below the surface and moved along the coastline at a steady rate of about 15 to 20 feet per second. The movement pattern was particularly disturbing. It was too regular and deliberate to be any known natural phenomena. Dr. Vasquez told the local news that in his 30 years of seismology, "I've never seen readings like these. The motion is purposeful, almost shrewd. Every night, it seems, as though a huge object follows a certain path beneath the beach." When acoustic experts at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution examined the recordings, the story garnered national attention. The specialists verified that the noises included intricate patterns that were similar to the communication systems in sea animals, but at amplitudes and frequencies that no known marine life could generate. As word got out, interested tourists started showing up at Myrtle Beach early in the morning in the hopes of witnessing the event for themselves. The beach became an odd destination for paranormal enthusiasts and amateur scientists, and local hotels began to provide sound excursions. When reports of odd side effects started to appear, the city council's initial excitement at the attention soon gave way to worrying. Those who spent a lot of time listening to the humming reported experiencing strange symptoms. Some people had vivid visions involving ancient civilizations and aquatic towns. Others spoke of experiencing an overwhelming feeling, as though summoned by something beneath the waves, to venture out into the ocean during the humming episodes. Some people claimed to have acquired a brief echolocation technique that allowed them to use their tongues to click in order to detect objects in total darkness. The most unsettling event happened on November 3rd, when some college students chose to spend the night camping on the beach in order to witness the phenomenon for themselves. 3:47 a.m. When the humming started, all 5 of the pupils got up at once and started to move in the direction of the water. They appeared to be enthralled with the sound as they danced in perfect unison while closing their eyes. Thankfully, a security guard in the area saw their actions and was able to rouse them before they got to the river. The pupils did not remember rising or making their way to the sea. They said they felt as if they had been dreaming of swimming in glowing, warm water with singing lights welcoming them home. Public safety became a growing concern for local government. The seashore of the city put up more illumination and warning signs along the shore, and the guards stepped their patrols during the humming episodes. More instances happened in spite of these safeguards. Several visitors required treatment for what seemed to be signs of hypnosis or trance states, and others described feeling lightheaded or confused after hearing the sound. In an effort to identify any odd behavior offshore, marine experts started keeping an eye on the ocean during the humming episodes. Perhaps the most disturbing part of the whole affair was what they found. All of the local aquatic creatures displayed extremely odd behavior during the 11-minute episodes. In flawless geometric patterns, fish swam, large groups of dolphins congregated and stayed still at the exterior. Even seabirds ceased their usual occupations to silently confront the ocean. Because the behavior was so extensive and persistent, scientists started to believe the humming was a biological signal that impacted all local species. The reality that people also appeared to be influenced by it, indicating something much deeper than just acoustic occurrences. The man at the center of a scientific enigma that was becoming more unsettling by the day was Jake Morrison. He kept up his nocturnal vigils, but it was getting more and more disturbing. It appeared that the buzzing was becoming stronger, and Jake discovered that he could pick up on minute changes in the sound that others were unable to. According to him, it's like learning a new language, Michelle was informed. Even though I don't understand what it's saying, I can sense that it's inviting, as if it's been waiting for someone to listen. When Jake reported that the humming pattern had changed in December, the situation escalated to a crisis point. The sound now lasted precisely 22 minutes, as opposed to the typical 11-minute bursts. The path beneath the beach had grown to a considerably larger area, and the vibrations were more intense. Jake's assertion that he could now hear the sound, if faintly, throughout the day, as though it were getting stronger or approaching the surface, was the most concerning. Dr. Vasquez returned with a bigger group of researchers, including experts in behavioral psychology, seismology, and marine acoustics. Their research showed that the issue was, in fact, becoming worse. Whatever was generating the vibrations was getting closer to the surface, according to the seismic data, and the acoustic patterns were becoming increasingly intricate and well organized. The intensity of the buzzing peaked on the evening of the winter solstice, December 21st, according to Jake, who had taken on the role of unofficial phenomena monitor. The sound was so strong that he could feel it in his bones. The tremors were intense enough to shake windows in houses close by, and individuals claimed to have heard the humming up to 5 miles inland. There was an unprecedented event that night. The ocean itself started to react as the humming peaked. A faint blue-green glow was observed by witnesses, extending across the water surface. Patterns of light appeared to dance and whirl in the waves as the glow pulsed in time with the humming. Jake was mesmerized by the scene as he stood on the beach. The water's glowing patterns appeared to be creating shapes, geometric patterns, that resembled writing, and the buzzing was so powerful that he could not think. For a while, he believed he knew what the sound was attempting to say. It served as a welcome, an invitation, and the summons to join something big and old that had been waiting for a very long time beneath the waters. That evening, the episode was precisely twice as long, lasting 44 minutes. The ocean returned to normal after it was over, and the enigmatic radiance dissipated. However, Jake was aware that a fundamental shift had occurred. Whatever was making the sound had changed, intensified, and was no longer satisfied with being concealed beneath the beach. Other coastal communities started to report in the weeks that followed. Similar humming noises were heard on North American beaches, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina. Like an audio illness, the phenomena was spreading down the shoreline. The identical trend was noticed at each location. Unique marine life behavior, hypnotic effects on listeners, and subterranean vibrations. 2 years later, the humming still occurs at Myrtle Beach every night. The city has come to terms with its enigmatic guest. Even though visitors must now sign disclaimers before engaging in late-night beach activities, Jake Morrison continues to work the sky overnight, listen to the nightly humming, and maintain the belief that whatever is down below is trying to communicate. However, he no longer believes that the sound is merely a result of nature. The designs are now too deliberate, too intricate, and too sensitive to human presence. Jake claims he can occasionally hear distinct voices inside the sound when the humming is quite intense. They were all singing in their thousands, harmony, all beckoning to those with the guts to pay attention. While the ocean maintains its secrets, Jake Morrison is aware that something patient and ancient is waking beneath the waves, and that it will soon choose to reveal itself to the world above. Free the sleepwalkers of Rehoboth Beach with travel bans and social distancing measures in place. Rehoboth Beach was expected to be peaceful throughout the 2020 summer. The seaside hamlet in Delaware anticipated significantly fewer tourists than normal. The smaller crowds appeared ideal for Dr. Amanda Cross, a sleep disorder specialist who had rented a seaside property for the season, who was doing research on how ocean sounds affect sleep patterns. Instead, what she learned would contradict all of her preconceived notions about human mind and the enigmatic power of coastal habitats. Rehoboth Beach was especially selected by Dr. Cross due to its exceptional acoustics. Because the town was situated on a curving section of coastline, the sound of the waves was amplified and focused in a way that other beaches couldn't match, creating a natural amphitheater effect. She had a straightforward plan: take note of the natural rhythms of the water and investigate how they affected the sleep patterns of the local population. In order to record the entire range of sea noises, she positioned sensitive microphones in the bedroom or the second floor of the cottage. Her sleep research would track her own heart rate, movement patterns, and brain waves as she slept to the sound of the waves. She anticipated spending a quiet summer gathering data for her single project, which was supported by a small grant. The first week proceeded according to plan. Every night, Cross slept soundly, soothed by the steady beat of the waves against the beach. She felt more rested than she had in years, and her equipment captured typical sleep patterns. The natural white noise of the water seems to encourage deeper, more rejuvenating sleep cycles. However, on the 9th night, a change occurred. At precisely 3:22 a.m., Dr. Cross awoke, to discover herself in her pajamas, standing on the beach with her feet buried in the icy sand. She couldn't recall ever leaving her cottage, traversing the dunes, or going down the wooden steps. The sound of soft waves lulling her to sleep was the last thing she recalled. She was shivering in the pre-dawn cold and absolutely confused as she stood 30 yards from the water's edge. As an expert on sleep, although Cross was aware of sleepwalking, she had never personally experienced it. Sleepwalking in adults was uncommon and typically brought on by stress, drug side effects, or lack of sleep. Those factors did not apply to her current circumstances. She felt at ease, didn't take any drugs, and slept well. The event upset. She chose to install a motion-activated camera in her bedroom because she loved her so much. She wanted to know what was causing her to sleepwalk, if she was experiencing it. Additionally, she started wearing a GPS tracker on her wrist that was set to notify her if she went more than 50 feet from her cottage while she was asleep. 3 nights later, it occurred once more. She was awakened at 2:47 a.m. by the GPS alarm. Then she discovered that she was standing facing the water in the same location on the beach. But she wasn't alone this time. Another person stayed still about 20 yards to her left in the beach. A middle-aged man wearing a t-shirt and boxer shorts was looking out at the waves with the same expressionless look she thought she'd seen just a few seconds earlier. Dr. Cross took a cautious approach to the man. Softly, "Excuse me," she said. "Are you all right?" The man didn't answer. He appeared to be looking through her instead of at her, even though his eyes were open. She touched his arm lightly, waking him up and causing him to gaze around in disbelief. "Where?" His voice was heavy with sleep as he said, "How did I get here?" "I don't understand. I was in my hotel room." The man identified himself as Robert Chen, a Philadelphia-based accountant who was lodging at the Hotel Boardwalk Plaza. Like Dr. Cross, he had no recall of leaving his room and no history of sleepwalking, both of them shocked by the event. They went back toward the boardwalk. Dr. Cross had a nagging suspicion that this was no accident. She made the informal decision to survey nearby motels and bed and breakfasts the following morning. What she found was troubling. At least a dozen visitors have complained of sleepwalking or unexpectedly waking up throughout the previous 2 weeks. Places, it was a strikingly constant pattern. The episodes took place from 2:30 to 3:30 in the morning, always when the tide is at its lowest at night. The sleepwalkers always found themselves standing in nearly the same places on the beach with their backs to the water. The fact that none of them had ever experienced sleep problems was the most unsettling. Dr. Michael Santos, a colleague at Johns Hopkins who focused on environmental sleep disorders, was contacted by Dr. Cross. Together, they started looking into what they first thought was a widespread psychogenic sickness, a psychic contagion brought on by the pandemic's extraordinary stress. When they learned that comparable instances had previously been reported in Rehoboth Beach, albeit infrequently, during the previous 50 years, their study took an unexpected route. Records of perplexed pedestrians discovered by the local police department on the beach early in the morning, but they had usually been written off as exceptional cases involving drunken visitors or those who already had mental health problems. Dr. Santos brought a group of graduate students and more monitoring equipment to Rehoboth Beach. They organized a thorough sleep research and enlisted volunteers from the hotel's patrons, who had gone through periods of sleepwalking. Finding any environmental elements that might be causing these widespread sleepwalking episodes was the aim. There was nothing like the outcomes in the scientific literature. During the bouts, the sleepwalkers displayed quite strange brainwave patterns. They're according to EEG data. They were in a hybrid state that mirrored some forms of hypnotic transances, neither entirely awake nor fully asleep. The finding that the sleepwalkers' brainwaves were synced was even more unsettling. All afflicted people displayed the same patterns of brain activity during the episodes, as though their thoughts were related in some way or reacting to the same outside stimulus. Dr. Cross's analysis of the acoustic data she had been gathering led to the breakthrough. She heard a very low-frequency signal that only happened during the lowest tide intervals, concealed among the typical sounds of wind and waves. Although the frequency was below the human hearing range, it was powerful enough to have an impact on the inner ear and possibly alter brain activity. The frequency of the so-called infrasound was precisely 7,883,883 strikes the Schumann resonance, which is the same frequency as the Earth's natural electromagnetic field. It is thought that this frequency synchronizes with human brain waves, especially while one is sleeping or meditating. According to Dr. Cross's theory, this infrasonic sound was magnified at particular tidal conditions due to the special geology of Rehoboth Beach, which created a natural resonance chamber. The vibrations produced by the sound waves as they passed through the bedrock and sand may enter buildings and disturb people who were asleep. However, the infrasound by itself was unable to elucidate the sleepwalkers' coordinated actions. They were being guided by something to stand in the same spots, facing the same way, at the same spot on the beach. The scientists started to believe that the infrasonic signal was somehow information encoded, a natural occurrence that operated similarly to a biological GPS system. The group made the decision to carry out a controlled experiment. They would use both human observers and electronic monitoring to keep an eye on a group of volunteers during the next anticipated sleepwalking incident. Their knowledge of human consciousness and the role of the environment on conduct was called into question by what they saw. To 52 a.m., 6 out of the 10 volunteers left their rooms at the same time on July 15th and started to stroll in the direction of the beach. Their motions were recorded by security cameras, which showed people purposefully pushing through doors, stairs, and other barriers while keeping their eyes closed. Balance even when they are actually asleep. The sleepwalkers all arrived at the same general location within minutes of one another, having converged on the beach from various places. They positioned themselves facing the ocean in a rough semicircle and stood still for precisely 11 minutes. Then, seemingly in response to some, they all turned and proceeded back to their individual quarters after receiving an unheard signal. Observing the incident from a safe distance, Dr. Cross saw something that chilled her to the bone. Not all of the sleepwalkers were standing at random. They were placed in a way that corresponded with how particular stars in the constellation were arranged. During the episode, Pisces was straight overhead. The finding implied that the sleepwalkers were somehow sensitive to both terrestrial and celestial stimuli in response to a complicated interplay between astronomical placement and infrasonic beach sounds. It seemed to be a kind of long-dormant innate activity that had lain dormant in human beings for thousands of years. As news of the study circulated, scientists, paranormal investigators, and inquisitive visitors began to flock to Rehoboth Beach. At first, the mayor of the town appreciated the attention, but as youngsters started experiencing the phenomena, The situation worsened as public safety worries increased, along with the number of reports of sleepwalking events. A household from Baltimore stated that their 8-year-old daughter was discovered standing on the beach with a group of adult sleepwalkers after leaving their hotel room during the night. The boy complained of having intense nightmares about swimming with the stars, but he had no recollection of the incident. Increased beach patrols during peak hours and magnetic locks on hotel room doors that needed deliberate effort to open were among the safety precautions put in place by the local government. The sleepwalking episodes persisted with clockwork regularity in spite of these safeguards. According to Dr. Cross's research, the issue was getting worse. The number of affected people was growing every week, and the infrasonic sounds were getting stronger. The finding that some individuals were becoming immune to the effect, while others were not, was more concerning, growing more attuned to it. When Dr. Cross started to transform, it was the most unsettling development. She discovered that she could predict the onset of sleepwalking episodes hours in advance after being exposed to the infrasonic vibrations for months. She talked of having a feeling that something was pulling her awareness in the direction of the water during a particularly impactful event on the evening of September 3rd. Dr. Cross made a choice that would follow her for the remainder of her professional life. Rather of watching from afar, she gave herself permission to, in an attempt to gain an internal understanding of the phenomenon, join the sleepwalkers. Later, she characterized the encounter as both transcendent and horrifying. She sensed a connection to something ancient and enormous that lay beneath the waves while she was sleepwalking. She sensed the presence of other minds, not just the other sleepwalkers, but something else entirely, as if the ocean pulsed with intellect. It was like being part of a collective consciousness. She wrote in her final report, "I realized that we were all answering a call that had been ringing for millions of years, when I sensed ideas and feelings that weren't mine. The ocean wasn't simply water. It was alive, and it was attempting to communicate." Dr. Cross woke up from the experience, which had lasted more than an hour, and she had no recollection of going into the water. She was standing waist deep in the surf, farther out from shore than any of the sleepwalkers had ever been. Her desire to continue walking deeper into the ocean, to join whatever was calling from beneath the waves, was the most upsetting realization. The research project ended abruptly when the University Ethics Board decided that the phenomenon posed a greater risk to continue studying. Although the monitoring equipment was taken out of Rehoboth Beach and Dr. Cross was called back to Baltimore, the sleepwalking occurrences were officially attributed to psychological problems associated to the pandemic and environmental stressors. Hotel managers discreetly patrol their hallways during the crucial hours, and the beach patrol keeps a low profile during low tide. Locals have learned to recognize the signs, such as the unusual stillness of the air, the way dogs become restless, and the subtle change in the rhythm of the ocean. In her unpublished notes, Cross hypothesized that the phenomenon represented a form of evolutionary memory, an ancient connection between humans and the ocean that had shaped our species' development over millions of years. Although she never went back to Rehoboth Beach, she continued to study the recordings and data from that summer. The most terrifying part of her, the acoustic patterns, showed a complex structure that resembled a form of language or code, and the infrasonic signals seemed to be strengthening over time, as if something beneath the ocean was gradually increasing its attempts to communicate. Today, Rehoboth Beach looked exactly as it always has, a tranquil coastal town. Research revealed that the infrasonic signals were not random natural phenomena, with immaculate beaches and soft waves, but those who are aware of the secret keep a close eye on the tides, and tourists are discreetly told to keep their doors locked and windows closed in the early morning hours. The ocean still calls, and occasionally people still answer, and they move through the streets in silence, their eyes closed and their minds open. For the tides of Cannon Beach, the first body washed up on Cannon Beach early on October 13, 2022, After Margaret Henley, 34, a Portland photographer, had been renting a beachfront home to photograph the stunning Oregon coastline during storm season, her landlord discovered that she had been waiting beneath the waves since the beginning of time, patiently calling its children home. Her camera was still fastened around her neck, and her body discovered tangled in kelp near the well-known Haystack Rock. Margaret's death was particularly unsettling not because she drowned, which happened every year along the Pacific coast, but rather because of the expression on her face. Even the experienced paramedics who arrived at the scene were shocked by what they saw. Margaret's mouth was open in what seemed to be a silent scream of sand and seaweed, and her eyes were wide open, staring with a ferocity that suggested she had witnessed something horrific in her last moments. The autopsy showed that Margaret had drowned, but there were no injuries consistent with being battered by waves against rocks, no signs of struggle, and her lungs were full of seawater. But her medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Morse, had worked on coastal drownings for 15 years, but she had never seen anything like this. If it weren't for what transpired over the course of 3 days, the case might have been closed as an accidental drowning. Dr. Morse told the investigating officer that the body exhibited no other trauma, and that it seemed as though she simply stopped fighting when she entered the ocean. Later, on the same stretch of beach, the body of Thomas Chen, a 41-year-old Seattle software engineer, was discovered dead. Like Margaret, he had been staying alone in a rental cottage, and his body displayed the same unsettling features: wide, scared eyes, and a gaping mouth that let out a silent scream. Detective Ray Kowalski, who had been tasked with investigating the deaths, found that the two victims had been healthy adults with no history of mental illness or suicidal thoughts, that they had been found in a similar location despite having lived in cottages almost a mile apart, and that they both had the same haunting expression of absolute terror. Both Margaret and Thomas had rented their cottages through the same property management company, Coastal Retreats LLC, whose owner, an elderly woman named Evelyn Marsh, had been renting beachfront properties in Cannon Beach for more than 30 years. His investigation into the rental properties where both victims had stayed was the first piece of a puzzle that would occupy him for months to come. She appeared truly horrified by the fatalities when interviewed by Detective Kowalski. "They were such nice people," Mrs. Marsh said, wringing her hands anxiously, while Margaret was thrilled about taking pictures of the storms. Thomas stated that all he wanted was some quiet. Detective Kowalski asked Mrs. Marsh if she had encountered any more weird situations with her rental properties, but she said, "I never imagined. I always warn my guests about the tides, but they seemed like experienced travelers." Detective Kowalski dug deeper into the cottage's rental history, but the elderly woman paused for a long time before responding. "Well, there have been some complaints over the years," she said, "of guests saying they heard strange sounds at night, or that they had trouble sleeping. A few people left early, said they felt unsettled, but I always assumed it was just the storm season making people nervous." What he discovered was a decades-long pattern of unsettling incidents. Many guests had left in the middle of their stays, forfeiting their deposits rather than stay another night at the properties. Others had complained of nightmares, insomnia, and a persistent sense of being watched. And the incident reports from prior years were even more concerning. During the last 10 years, guests had made 17 emergency calls at Mrs. Marsh's properties. 3 guests were hospitalized for severe anxiety attacks, 2 were discovered wandering the beach in their pajamas, claiming they had been called by something in the water, and the majority were described as wellness checks after guests had called 911, reporting intruders or threatening presences. Only 4 police to find nothing. Detective Kowalski chose to spend a night in one of the cottages himself after a number of unsettling incidents had been written off by local authorities as the inevitable outcome of renting to anxious city people who weren't used to the remoteness and harsh weather of the Oregon coast. He picked the property where Thomas Chen had slept, a modest but cozy cottage only 50 yards from the high tide line. Hoping to learn what might be bothering the guests, Mrs. Marsh grudgingly allowed him to remain, although she appeared to be very uneasy with the prospect. Detective Kowalski couldn't understand why guests would want to stay at the cottage, which looked perfectly normal during the day, clean, well maintained, and equipped with modern conveniences and comfortable furniture, and the breathtaking view of the Pacific Ocean, which included endless stretches of sandy beach and haystack rock in the distance, would find the place unnerving. But as evening drew near, something changed. The windows, which had offered such lovely views during the day, now felt like dark eyes staring in from the darkness outside. The sound of the waves seemed to get louder and colder despite the heating system operating normally. And most unsettling of all, as the night wore on, Detective Kowalski tried to fall asleep but ended up lying awake, listening to the hypnotic sound of the waves crashing against the shore, but something beneath it, a faint pattern that sounded almost like voices whispering in the foam, made him think it was all in his head. But the Detective Kowalski's uneasiness grew until he heard something at 2:30 a.m. that made him sit up in bed. He could swear he heard someone calling his name over the sound of the waves. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the cottage's small deck, where the beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the foam-covered sand and the retreating waves. The voice was faint, nearly lost in the wind, but it seemed to be coming from the direction of the beach. For a moment, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. But then, at the very edge of within range of his flashlight, he saw a figure standing in the surf, a woman in a white dress who seemed to be standing still as the waves crashed around her legs, facing the cottage, and even from a distance, he could see that she was looking right at him. He called out to her to check on her, but she didn't answer. Detective Kowalski picked up his jacket and sprinted toward the beach, though it took him several minutes to make it to the water's edge due to the soft, dark sand, and when he did, he found the place where he had seen the figure deserted, save for a few driftwood and seaweed fragments. Using his flashlight, he searched the area for the next hour, but could find no sign of the woman, no footprints in the sand, no indication that anyone had been standing in the surf. Detective Kowalski started to question whether he had dreamed the whole thing, but the image of the woman in white was still clear in his mind. Upon being asked about the cottage's history the following morning by Detective Kowalski, Mrs. Marsh appeared hesitant to share a story that had been suppressed for decades. Had there been any fatalities on the property, any tragic events that could account for the strange happenings? When Sarah Whitmore drowned in 1987, she was staying at the cottage with her fiancé, celebrating their engagement with a romantic weekend break. The police report stated that Sarah had gone for a solitary walk on the beach and never came back, discovered washed up near Haystack Rock the following morning. After being questioned extensively, the fiancé, David Morrison, was eventually exonerated of any wrongdoing, claiming that Sarah had been acting strangely during their stay, complaining of nightmares and feeling as though something was watching her from the ocean. She had woken up at 2:30 the night before she died. Mrs. Marsh informed Detective Kowalski that David was never the same after she told him that she needed to take a walk to clear her thoughts in the morning. The story of Sarah Whitmore's death was disturbingly similar to the pattern of recent drownings. Like Margaret and Thomas, she had been a healthy adult with no history of mental illness, but he was unable to explain why she had been afraid of something in the water. He left Oregon soon after the funeral and never returned. Detective Kowalski realized that the cottage itself might be linked to the deaths because, like them, she had been staying alone when she died. Her fiancé had been asleep when she went out for her last stroll, and she had been discovered looking absolutely terrified. When he looked into the history of the property, he found that it had been constructed on the site of a much older building, a lighthouse keeper house that had been there since the early 1900s and had been decommissioned in 1943 following a string of tragic events, including the 1941 storm that claimed the lives of the lighthouse keeper, Henry Blackwood, who had lost his wife and 2 children. The family had been caught in a sudden squall on their way back from town by boat. According to historical records, their bodies were never found, but parts of their boat had washed up on the beach near the lighthouse, and Henry Blackwood, who had grown more unstable after the tragedy, said he could see his family in the waves. In 1943, Henry walked into the surf during a storm and never came back. His body was discovered 3 days later, wearing the same look of fear that would later be seen on Sarah Whitmore's face. Neighbors said that he would stand on the beach 4 hours at night, speaking to the ocean as if someone was responding. Thomas Chen and Margaret Henley, the site had been in the Blackwood family for decades, but the lighthouse had been demolished soon after Henry's passing. Mrs. Marsh bought the property in 1982 and constructed the cottage that presently stood there, claiming she had never heard of the lighthouse or the sad past of the area. On October 28th, a 29-year-old artist named Jennifer Walsh, who had been residing in another of Mrs. Marsh's cottages, was discovered drowned on the same stretch of beach, interrupting Detective Kowalski's investigation. Detective Kowalski felt a growing sense of urgency as he realized that more people were likely to die if he couldn't solve the mystery, and that she had been found with the same terrifying expression frozen on her face, just like the previous victims. The pattern was now undeniable. Something was affecting the guests at these particular properties, something that was pushing them to walk into the ocean and drown. The second night in the cottage was even more unsettling than the first, but Detective Kowalski was determined to experience whatever was affecting the guests, so he made the decision to go back to the cottage for another night, this time with backup equipment and another officer to keep an eye on him from a distance. At 2:30 a.m., Detective Kowalski could swear he saw figures moving in the froth. The ocean looked to pulse with an unearthly light, and the sound of the waves seemed to grow louder as darkness fell, drawing him again and again to the windows overlooking the beach. Detective Kowalski heard the voices again at the same moment he had seen the woman in white, but this time they were clearer and more insistent, and he could make out specific words in the crash of the waves. "Come, join home." It sounded as though the voices were calling to him specifically, promising him peace and an end to his problems. When Detective Kowalski realized with horror that he was suffering from the same compulsion that had driven the victims to their deaths, he fought the urge to go down to the beach, to stand in the surf and let the waves wash away his pain and fears. It was so strong that he actually got up and started toward the door before catching himself. Detective Kowalski called his backup. The episode lasted exactly 1 hour, at 3:30 a.m., and the officer on the radio described what he was seeing. He was in a patrol car about 4 miles away and said he could see lights moving on the beach near the cottage, but he couldn't make out any specific figures. Detective Kowalski felt tired, but relieved that he had resisted the compulsion. He now realized that the victims had been overcome by the same supernatural summons that had almost claimed him. The voices subsided, the lights vanished, and the ocean resumed its regular rhythm. When questioned about his reasoning, Detective Kowalski filed a report describing the deaths as being caused by environmental factors that pose an ongoing threat to public safety. The following morning, he made a decision that would essentially end his career. He called the state authorities and recommended that Mrs. Marsh's rental properties be condemned and permanently closed. Safety. The rental homes were left unprotected, and Mrs. Marsh kept renting them to unwary visitors. The report was viewed with suspicion and raised questions about Detective Kowalski's mental health. He was placed on administrative leave and had to be evaluated psychologically. 2 months later, a 38-year-old California teacher who had been residing in the same cottage where Detective Kowalski had encountered the supernatural calling was discovered dead on Cannon Beach, her face displaying the same look of utter terror as the victims before her. The deaths continue to this day, happening every few months with unsettling regularity, and Detective Kowalski, now retired and living in a town far from the coast, learned of the death from a former colleague and was deeply guilty that he had failed to stop it. But he also knew that no one would believe his version of what was actually happening at those cottages. Locals have started to whisper about the cursed cottages of Cannon Beach, but their warnings are dismissed as superstition. The medical examiner's office has classified them as accidental drownings, and the rental properties are still popular with tourists looking for a tranquil getaway on the Oregon coast. Mrs. Marsh continues to rent the cottages, though she has started requiring guests to sign extensive liability waivers by outsiders. The few survivors who have experienced the supernatural calling, such as Detective Kowalski, are reluctant to talk about what they saw in public. The cottages built on the site of the old lighthouse continue to receive calls from the ocean, and on calm nights, when the tide is high and the wind is still, visitors claim to hear the beach appears serene during the day, with families playing in the sand and surfers riding the waves. But those who know the truth stay away from the area after dark, especially between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. The voices in the waves are the voices of Henry Blackwood and his lost family, forever calling others to join them in the depths. When the dead emerge from the depths to take on fresh victims for their never-ending watch under the waves. Music. Danny Martinez had been a night security guard at Folly Beach for 3 years when he first witnessed them. Danny was on his usual patrol along the South Carolina coastline at 2:15 a.m. on the steamy August night in 2021 when he saw something moving in the dunes near the old pier. Initially supposing it was simply another group of inebriated college students who had disregarded the beach's 11 p.m. curfew. The figures were too tall, too thin, and they moved with an unnatural jerky gait that made Denny's skin crawl. These were not teenagers, though, as he approached with his flashlight. During the summer, Folly Beach drew thousands of young visitors, and Danny had become used to chasing off late-night parters. They were digging in the sand with their bare hands, working frantically as if they were looking for something buried in the dunes. "Hey," Danny called out, his voice echoing across the deserted beach. Bees closed after 11. Many of them were wearing what appeared to be outdated attire, long coats, and wide-brimmed hats that looked like they belonged to a different century. The figures halted their digging and turned to face him. Even from a distance of 50 feet, Danny could see their features well in the moonlight, and the sight of them chilled his blood. Their skin was pallid and soaked, and it hung loosely from their bones like damp fabric. Danny staggered backward, his hand automatically reaching for the radio on his belt. But when he looked up again, the figures were gone, the beach deserted save for the distant cry of a seagull and the sound of waves, and their eyes were black pits that seemed to absorb the light from his flashlight, their mouths hanging open in perpetual silent screams. For the remainder of his shift, Danny couldn't get rid of the image of those terrible faces, telling himself it had been a hallucination caused by fatigue and too much coffee. But the only sign that anything had been there was a series of deep holes in the sand, perfectly round and filled with dark water that hadn't been there moments before. The following night, they returned, and although he had been working double shifts to cover his daughter's medical fees, the stress was obviously wearing on him. This time, Danny noticed them from a distance and chose to watch rather than confront, using binoculars to watch as the around 2 a.m. figures appeared in the surf, their bodies pulled onto the sand, their bodies soaked, leaving behind foam and seaweed tracks. They proceeded purposefully, congregating in a circle close to the same location where Danny had seen them digging the previous evening. Ritual, if it was, lasted precisely 1 hour. The figures would use their hands to dig, pause and stand still, though they were listening to something Danny couldn't hear, then start digging again, working more quickly and frantically until they abruptly stopped and went back to the ocean, vanishing under the waves as quietly as they had come. When Danny tried to explain what he had seen, Marcus Webb, Danny's supervisor and a practical man with over 10 years of beach security experience, first wrote it off as stress-induced hallucinations. However, he agreed to look at the security camera footage from the area where Danny claimed to have seen the figures, but the cameras showed nothing. The video showed Danny standing alone on the beach, seemingly talking to and shining his flashlight at nothing, which was even more unsettling. "Maybe you should take a few days off," Marcus said in a worried tone. The timestamp showed the precise times Danny had reported seeing the figures, but the beach looked completely deserted. "Recently, you've been working too hard. Sometimes when you're obviously exhausted, your mind deceives you." If it weren't for the events of the next weekend, Danny might have agreed with this explanation. Emma Patterson, an 8-year-old girl from a Colombian family who had rented a beach house for the week, discovered something hidden in the sand when she was playing on the beach. The wallet was made of leather and was so old and ruined that it disintegrated under the weight of the water. Inside, however, were what looked to be 1943 identification documents and a picture of a young woman, preserved by some miracle. The first name on the documents seemed to be Catherine, although it was partially illegible. Emma's parents got in touch with the Folly because they believed it might be a historical artifact. The Beach Museum, Dr. Sarah Chen, the curator at the museum, looked over the wallet and verified that it was, in fact, from the 1940s, the place where it had been discovered. The same spot where Danny had been seeing the enigmatic figures was. More intriguing, Dr. Chen's investigation uncovered a heartbreaking tale that the local population had mostly forgotten. The Charleston Belle, a passenger ferry, was caught in an unexpected storm in September 1943 while sailing from Charleston to Folly Beach, when the ferry sank in the shallow waters just offshore from where the pier is now. It was carrying 42 passengers and crew. 31 persons have drowned as a result of the storm and darkness hindering rescue efforts. Their bodies were never found again, most likely carried out to sea by the powerful currents. One of the worst marine catastrophes in the region's history had occurred. However, the tragedy had been forgotten and eclipsed by World War II. Dr. Wen Cheng got in touch with Danny regarding the wallet. He told her this information. His sensation of fear only grew when he realized that people had perished in the very place where he had been seeing the figures. He started to believe that what he was seeing was something more darker than hallucinations. 3 weeks later, Danny saw the data for the third time, which served as confirmation. One of them came straight at him this time, using that same jerky, a natural gait. It was a woman in a dress from the 1940s, and as it got closer, Danny could see that her hair was hanging in damp strands around her face. She came to a stop 10 feet from him, and parted her lips as though to speak. Danny could see her lips moving to make words he couldn't hear, but no sound came out. She kept pointing at the sand underfoot, then at the sea, and finally back at the sand. Her message was unambiguous. She was pointing out to him the location of a burial. Despite all his instincts telling him to flee, Danny found himself approaching her. It was terrible to gaze at the woman's face. She had discolored and swollen skin. Sea salt blurred her vision, and she flicked tiny crabs in and out of her lips. However, there was a desperate look on her face, an imploring tone that, rather than intimidating Danny, gave him the impression that she was requesting assistance. The woman disappeared as he arrived at the location she had been pointing to. Even though Danny was by himself on the beach, he sensed that the sand beneath his feet was different. There seemed to be a void beneath the surface, as though it were hollow. Danny made a choice that would alter everything the following morning. He got in touch with the Charleston County Sheriff's Office and asked them to look inside the spot where the woman indicated. He talked about the boat accident, the wallet, and his suspicion that there might be bones buried in the sand. Despite her skepticism, Detective Lisa Rodriguez consented to bring a ground-penetrating radar equipment to the beach, about 6 feet below the surface. The scan showed what looked to be a sizable hollow that was about the size and shape of a small space. The numerous irregularities in the shape of artifacts that were consistent with human remains and dispersed throughout the whole were more worrisome. The next day the dig got underway. What they discovered validated Denny's worst suspicions and exposed the actual tragedy of what had transpired at Folly Beach almost 8 decades before. In fact, the cavity was a room the Charleston Bell's passenger compartment preserved. In an air pocket beneath the sand, the bones of 13 people who were trapped when the ship sank were discovered inside. The victims were buried alive when the shifting sands covered the debris, indicating that they had survived the initial sinking. The remains condition indicated that the travelers had survived for a while after being buried, desperately trying to break out by scratching at the walls of their submerged tomb. The placement of the bodies suggested that some of the victims had perished while attempting to dig their way out through the sand above, and scratch marks on the metal walls told a tale of unspeakable misery. The forensic anthropologist who studied the remains, Dr. Patricia Morse, was clearly disturbed by what she discovered. She informed the investigative team that these individuals were not killed in the ferry tragedy. They were stuck in an air pocket after surviving the sinking. Before they eventually passed away from oxygen and dehydration, they most likely lived 4 days or even weeks. The revelation clarified the reason behind the ghost's attempts to speak with Danny. Desperate to be located and buried properly after being lost under the sand for almost 80 years, they had been trying to guide him to their remains. However, another discovery was made during the excavation. Danny realized that his experiences with the ghosts were far from over because of something. Evidence that the imprisoned passengers had not been alone in their submerged tomb was discovered among the remains. The bones of what looked like fish, crabs, and other marine life that had somehow gotten into the enclosed section were scattered all over the compartment. The bite marks on the human remains were much more unsettling. It seems that the stranded passengers had to struggle to get out of their sandy jail while fending off hostile sea monsters. According to the facts, the ferry something from the deep ocean had broken into the compartment and tortured the dying passengers in their last days. According to Dr. Morse's study, the bones had odd trauma patterns, such as puncture marks that weren't consistent with any known marine species. Anything that had been in the passenger compartment had been big, hostile, and had claws or sharp teeth. The Charleston Bell's ghosts ought to have been at peace after the corpses were found. However, Danny quickly discovered that the situation had gotten worse as a result of upsetting their undersea tomb. He spotted more persons on the beach than ever the night after the dig was finished. Not only the hundreds of wet ghosts rising out of the surf instead of the original 4, they didn't seem to be looking for something in the sand anymore. Rather, they dragged themselves onto the beach with a visibly terrified gait, as if they were running from something in the ocean. Some had serious cuts across their bodies, while others had missing limbs, their body and faces, and they all continued to stare back at the sea as though they were being pursued. The ghosts gathered on the beach, their mouths opening and closing in silent moans, and Danny gazed in fear, as though to alert him to something coming from the depths. They first pointed at the water, and then at Danny. The next night, when Danny saw what the ghosts had been running from, the warning became evident. Just offshore, something enormous shifted. Beneath the waves, a disturbance in the water, resembling a submarine passing just below the surface, indicated its existence. Danny saw what looked like tentacles or appendages breaking the surface as it travelled parallel to the beach. They are each about 20 feet long. Whatever the creature was, it appeared to be on patrol. The location of the ferry sinking. Parts of a body that was unlike anything in the known marine biological record might occasionally appear. Danny noticed rows of teeth that seemed like they belonged in a primordial nightmare, clusters of eyes that glowed with their own light, and pieces of armor that resembled shells. The understanding struck Danny like a blow to the body. This was what the stranded passengers had been in the ferry compartment This was the thing that had haunted them in their last days, consuming their anxiety and despair before taking their lives. Somehow, the dig had roused it, and it was hunting once more. The ghost's intense desire to speak with Danny was explained by the creature's presence. They hadn't only been looking for personal tranquility. They were attempting to alert him to the old predator that had killed them and was now able to prey once again. A week following the excavation, Danny had her last experience with Folly Beach's otherworldly forces. While on his routine patrol, he saw that there were more ghosts than ever before congregating on the beach, with their arms extended as though to shield Danny from an impending threat from the sea. They positioned themselves in a protective line between him and the ocean. With a noise comparable to glass shattering and metal shredding, the beast surfaced from the water. It was worse than Danny had already been envisioned, a combination of octopus, crab, and something that was never supposed to be above the sea floor. Its mouth opened to expose rows of broken glass like fangs, and its eyes stared at Danny with a cruel and alien intellect. With their ethereal bodies, the spirits hurled themselves at the beast, managing to slow it in advance. Danny marveled as the Charleston Bell passengers' ghosts battled to keep him safe. In the face of the monster that had slain them, their decades of anguish turned into bravery. The conflict lasted just a few seconds. Tentacles of the beast swept like vapor across the spirits, scattering them for a time before they regrouped and launched another assault. But Danny was able to run because of their sacrifice, and he ran across the beach to the security car that was waiting in the parking lot. Behind him, he heard the roar of the beast. Annoyance upon realizing its victim has gotten away. The sound appeared to tremble the earth's very foundations, like metal grinding against stone. The following morning, Danny resigned from his position and relocated his family to a place that was distant from the seaside. He left a thorough written statement with Dr. Chen, but he never discussed what he had seen in public, in the hopes that someone would take notice of his narrative and take action to safeguard future visitors to the Folly Beach Museum. The beach was restored to the public after the excavation site was discreetly filled in. According to official accounts, the remains of the Charleston Bell passengers have been found and buried properly, ending a tragedy that lasted 4 decades. Neither the creature nor the continuing strange activity were mentioned. However, Danny's tale didn't stop when he left Folly Beach. He was contacted by Dr. Chen 6 months later. In the last month, 3 more night security personnel had resigned. Every reporter reports seeing strange things on the beach. The ghosts of the Charleston Bell were still attempting to shield innocent people from the monster that had killed them, and the thing was still out there, hunting. Folly Beach, a well-liked tourist spot with gorgeous sand and great surfing conditions, appears just as it has always done. However, the area's night security officers are aware that the ancient pier should not be visited after 2 a.m. Additionally, the local government has subtly enhanced police presence at night. The animal continues to hunt in the shallow seas off the coast, and the Charleston Bell's ghosts continue to appear from the surf to protect the beach or which they perished. Visitors say they see people dressed in traditional attire strolling along the water's edge on calm evenings when the tide is low and the moon is dark. Their gaze is focused on the ocean, searching for something that should never have been disturbed. From its deep sea burial, 6 the children of Gulf Shore's Amy Rodriguez initially believed the kids were just early risers when she first saw them playing on the beach, savoring the daybreak in Alabama. The time was 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in June 2022. Amy was jogging in the morning along Gulf Shore's immaculate white beach when she spotted several children constructing sandcastles close to the water's edge. She found it strange that how well they were still. The majority of kids that age, who looked to be between 6 and 10, would be splashing in the waves, laughing and running around. However, as though they were listening to something Amy couldn't hear, these children sat still in a perfect circle, their heads angled at the same angles and their hands buried deep in the sand. Amy slowed as she got closer, intending to greet the early beachgoers with a good morning wave. However, as she approached, she became aware that something was seriously amiss. The children's skin was translucent and pale, with dark veins showing through. Wet strands of hair hung from them, even though they were situated far above the line of high tide. The most unsettling aspect was that their eyes were entirely white. No irises or pupils, just milky, blank eyes that appeared to look right through her. Amy yelled out in a trembling voice, "Hey, are you kids okay?" Just a little, in perfect sync, all 5 of the kids turned their heads in her direction, their motions robotic and unnatural. They both opened their mouths at the same time, but they made no sound. Amy could see that little crabs crawled between their teeth, and their jaws were full of seaweed and sand. Amy's heart was pounding as she staggered back. The children vanished. When she blinked, other than the sound of the waves and the cries of the seagulls above, the beach was deserted. A complete circle of deep holes in the sand was the only sign that anything had ever been there. They were all filled with dark water that acted as black mirrors, reflecting the dawn sky. Marcus, Amy's spouse, had been a Gulf Shores police officer for 8 years. Despite his skepticism, he agreed to patrol the beach early the following morning when Amy told him what she had witnessed. His view of what was feasible in their sleepy seaside village was altered by what he saw. "I've observed," Marcus subsequently informed Amy. "I worked nights on the beach and did a lot of strange things. Drunk tourists, people on drugs, kids playing pranks. But this was different. Those weren't living children, Amy. I don't know what they were, but they weren't alive." Marcus had parked in his police car so he could use binoculars to view the beach. At precisely 6:30 a.m., he saw the kids emerge from the sea. As they surfaced from the water, their pallid shapes solidified. He was particularly troubled by the manner in which they moved. Not like kids at all, but more like marionettes, under the direction of an invisible puppeteer. Marcus got in touch with the Gulf Shores Historical Society to start the research. Eleanor Whitman, a retired schoolteacher who had spent her entire life in the neighborhood, served as the society's president. Her face became white as Marcus told her about the kids. She said, "You've seen them, too." Eleanor's narrative brought to light a tragedy that had been largely forgotten. The children from the Hurricane Bethany disaster. September 1979. The Alabama shore had been devastated by Hurricane Bethany. More than 200 individuals who were unable to leave in time were housed in the Sunrise Elementary School, which had been converted into an emergency shelter. The storm surge had been significantly higher than anyone had expected, and the school was only 3 blocks from the shore. At the height of the hurricane ferocity, the town was overrun by a 20-foot-tall wall of water that overcame the school's fortifications. Only 43 of the 200 individuals in the refuge had made it out alive. The retreating storm surge had carried the others out to sea. 27 children, ages 5 to 12, were among the victims. There had never been any recovery of their bodies, according to Eleanor. The survivors all related the same tale. They claimed that when the water struck, the kids were having fun together in the main hallway of the school. When the surge carried them away, they were holding hands and attempting to stay together. The kids vanishing into the murky water was the last thing anyone saw. Amy started going to the beach every morning at 6:30 a.m. while still holding hands. Recording the looks of the kids. What she found was frightening and heartbreaking. In their circle, the kids weren't merely sitting still, they waited. Every time waves came close to the coast, their heads would turn in unison, and their white eyes would follow movement in the sea. According to Amy's investigation, the kids weren't merely hapless victims. They had been inseparable throughout their lives as best friends, siblings, and cousins. Each had died in an attempt to save the other, clutching hands as they were swept into the night by the river. They now waited for their loved ones to return from the depths, caught in an unending vigil. More and more of the children were showing up. They had been seen maybe once or twice a year in the 1980s. They now showed up practically every day in the summer of 2022. Amy started to believe that the rising frequency was related to both the intensifying storms around the Gulf Coast and climate change. Amy was watching the kids go through their routine on the morning of July 15th, when an unexpected summer storm blew across the beach. The youngsters did not vanish as they usually did, but instead became more lively. They left their circle and started pointing at the storm that was coming. They screamed silently, their mouths opening and closing. Amy was horrified to see the kids start to move toward the sea with their arms out in the direction of the storm. Prior to arriving at the surf, the children pointed right at Amy as they turned back toward the shore. It was an obvious message. The living were being alerted to the impending storm by them. 3 days later, the storm hit Gulf shores, resulting in widespread property damage and flooding. Light rain was all that the National Weather Service had forecast, but the hurricane quickly grew stronger, much like Hurricane Bethany did 43 years before. Amy saw that the growing number of children wasn't coincidental. They served as a warning mechanism. The spirits were attempting to save other kids from going through what they experienced. In an effort to explain the relationship to others, Amy started recording their looks and tying them to weather trends. However, Amy's health started to suffer as a result of her interactions with the spirits. She began to hear children's voices in the wind and had intense nightmares about drowning. Her increasing preoccupation with the ocean was the most unsettling. She was always drawn to the ocean, experiencing an unfathomable urge to wade farther out into the surf. When Amy did not return after her customary beach outing, the situation escalated. Surrounded by the spectral kids, Marcus discovered her standing waist-deep in the surf. Her eyes had become the same milky white, and she was holding hands with one of the spirits. Amy said, "They need me," to Marcus. "I can see what they see now. The danger coming across the water. They need someone to help them watch for the storms. They've been alone for so long." Marcus was able to get Amy back to shore, but she was never the same. She talked a lot about the suffering of the kids and their intense desire to keep others safe. She asserted that she could sense their memories, the fear of being carried away, the anguish of drowning, and the never-ending sorrow of being cut off from their loved ones. Despite being admitted to the hospital for assessment, Amy maintained that her experiences were genuine. Doctors were trying to forecast the storms and the children, and she pleaded with them to believe her predictions. Amy vanished from the hospital in September 2022 during Hurricane Ian. 3 days later, she was discovered sitting on the beach in the same circle where the ghosts had been seen. Amy was still living, but she was no longer wholly human. She had transformed into a bridge that connected the realms of the living and the dead. She added her voice to the never-ending vigil of the children who had perished in Hurricane Bethany by spending her days on the beach, observing the Gulf for indications of impending storms. Visitors to Gulf shores now occasionally claim to have spotted a woman seated with a group of kids at dawn on the beach. They are consistently characterized as being damp, pallid, and having white eyes that appear to look past the horizon. The phantom figures have always proven accurate in warning of impending storms, so locals know to listen when they get upset. The kids from Hurricane Bethany keep up their never-ending watch. Now joined by Amy Rodriguez, who decided to give up her humanity in order to assist them in protecting others. Together, they protect the Gulf Coast, always on the lookout for the kind of storm that wrecked their lives and committed to making sure that no other kids have to go through what they did. 7. The daughter of the lighthouse keeper, Jessica Blake, initially believed the singing was coming from her neighbor's radio. The time was 11:47 p.m. Jessica was working late on a foggy October night in 2023 in her cottage near Bar Harbor, which had a view of the main coastline. The voice had a haunting tone and was lovely, a young girl's soprano that appeared to glide on the wind. In order to complete her manuscript, Jessica had hired the remote cottage. The old Beacon Point lighthouse, which had been abandoned since 1962, was 200 yards away from it. The lighthouse had been deserted 4 decades, and her closest neighbor lived more than a mile away. As Jessica continued to listen, she carefully identified the lighthouse ruins as the source of the singing. A child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, could be heard singing what sounded like a lullaby. There was total silence once the song abruptly ended after exactly 13 minutes. Jessica discovered new footprints the following morning in the mud surrounding the foundation of the lighthouse, tiny footprints in a precise spiral pattern around the base of the tower. Later that night, Jessica set up binoculars at her window. It was precisely 11:47 p.m. The song started up again. She could make out through the fog a little girl in a white frock at the base of the lighthouse, making slow circles around the tower. Her feet barely touched the floor, and her flesh shone brightly, as though illuminated from within. The girl's expression was the most unsettling. Her face was contorted in agony, but she was singing. She was crying uncontrollably. The anguish in her eyes was so deep that Jessica's own heart broke. Jessica went to the lighthouse after grabbing a flashlight. The door stood ajar, but the girl was gone. On the ground was the broken rusty chain that held it in place. Jessica entered and made her way up the slender stone stairs. Children's drawings were all over the walls. Crude drawings of drowning people, ships, and storms, words in a child's handwriting were etched into the stone at the top of the lamp room. Papa never returned after saying, "Stay and watch, keep the light on." The date, October 15th, 1962, was shown below. Jessica's investigation uncovered the horrible past. Thomas Whitmore, the last lighthouse keeper, had resided there with his daughter Mary, who was 8 years old. Thomas vowed to return before nightfall when he set out to fetch supplies from Bar Harbor in October 1962. However, a violent storm left him stranded in town for 2 days. Mary's body was at the top of the tower when Thomas eventually made it back on October 15th. Determined to steer ships safely beyond the rocks, she had attempted to keep the beacon going on her own. However, the lamp had run out of oil and Mary had perished from exposure while attempting to keep the light going. Thomas held himself responsible for the loss of his daughter. Soon after, he vanished. Weeks later, his body was discovered on the rocks beneath the lighthouse. The narrative clarified the reason for Mary's spirit's imprisonment, but it did not address the reason behind her unexpected appearance to Jessica. When Jessica learned that the lighthouse would be demolished in November, she had the answer. The danger to Mary's perpetual watch had roused her soul. Jessica started having more powerful experiences. At night, the youngster would show up at her window, her pallid face pressed against the glass. Occasionally, Jessica would awaken to the sound of singing coming from her cottage, as though Mary were present. When Jessica discovered Mary standing in her bedroom at 3 in the morning, it was the most unsettling moment. Gazing with those eyes of desperation. Although the spirit remained silent, Jessica could sense her thoughts and her intense desire to carry out the task her father had assigned her. Mary said, "You have to help me." In Jessica's consciousness, "I can't allow them to," Papa said. "I have to keep watching." Jessica attempted to explain that the lighthouse was no longer necessary, that modern navigation had rendered it obsolete. But Mary's spirit was stuck in the past, unable to comprehend that the world had changed. Demolish the lighthouse. The ships need the light. Mary's diary was discovered by Jessica, concealed in the lighthouse wall. "Papa still hasn't returned. The ships need the light, but I don't know how to fix it. I'm so cold and scared, but I have to keep watching." The last post, dated October 15th, 1962, stated, "Do my job, girl, and he'll return. The light must remain on." Jessica realized Mary's ghost would never find peace until she was released from her father's final command. The child's spirit was bound by Thomas's last words: "Stay and watch. Don't turn off the light." Jessica carried a battery-operated lantern up to the top of the lighthouse the night before it was demolished. It was precisely 11:47 p.m. Mary showed up and started singing her nightly tune. Jessica came from the lamp room and yelled down, "It's okay, Mary," Jessica said. "I was dispatched by your papa to let you know that you can now relax. You've watched for a very long time and have been such a lovely girl. Now that the ships are secure, it's time for you to leave." Mary paused her song and raised her eyes. With those desperation and sadness, she grinned softly after that. It was the first time Jessica had ever seen the child's face show anything but agony. "Papa?" Mary's voice hardly made a sound. "Yes, dear. Papa says it's time for you to return home. It's time for you to relax, even if you did a fantastic job watching." Mary nodded before fading away, her glowing body turning clear, and Jessica heard her go. Finally, in a quiet but relieved voice, "Thank you for informing me. I was so sick of being by myself." The following morning, the lighthouse was destroyed, but Jessica was unfazed as she saw the ancient tower fall apart. Mary's soul had at last found serenity, freed from the obligation that had held her for 60 years. The fog no longer carries the sound of a child's voice singing mournful lullabies, but the cottage is still rented to tourists. Mary Whitmore had maintained her vigil for more than 60 years, demonstrating that love can both transcend death and become a prison. Her story serves as a reminder that the most profound hauntings are not caused by evil spirits, but rather by souls who loved too much and could not bear to let go. 8. The Mendocino tidal pools at 5:30 a.m. Dr. Rachel Morrison first noticed the woman in the tidal pools, mistaking her for a tourist who had approached too closely to the sea. The woman appeared to be kneeling in one of the deeper pools, her long dark hair flowing around her shoulders as she bent over the water, wearing what appeared to be a white nightgown that billowed in the surf. And Rachel was doing her weekly marine biology survey along the rocky coastline near Mendocino, California, on a grey September morning in 2023. Rachel was totally unaware of the Rachel climbed cautiously across the slick rocks and shouted out, "Mum," as the icy waves crashed around her. "The tide is coming in," she said. "It's not secure." The woman remained silent. Rachel stumbled backwards when the woman, who was about 20 feet away, gently raised her head and looked directly at her. The woman's eyes were glazed over with the milky film of death, and her face was pale and swollen, with purple-black bruises on her flesh. The most horrifying aspect of the scene was the woman's mouth, where barnacles clung to her cheeks like hideous jewelry, and tiny crabs scuttled out of her mouth and vanished into the tide pool, while seaweed hung from her hair like a funeral shroud instead of words. 3 days later, the woman reappeared, and Rachel watched through binoculars as she carried out what seemed to be a ritual. The tide pool was empty except for the usual sea life, but there were several long strands of black hair floating on the surface, and the water was stained dark red. Rachel blinked, and the woman was gone. Rachel's research uncovered a tragic story. A local woman named Catherine Blackwood drowned in the tide pools during a winter storm in 1987. She would reach into the tide pool with both hands, pulling up handfuls of seaweed and shells, holding them to her chest as if speaking to them, and then letting everything go back into the water. 3 days after Rachel saw the ghostly woman, her body was discovered trapped in the same tide pool where Catherine, a marine biologist for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, had been working. Rachel called Dr. Margaret Chen, Catherine's research partner, who was fascinated by those tide pools. Dr. Chen informed Rachel that she spent every spare hour there researching the effects of human activities on marine life. Catherine called me at midnight the night she passed away, claiming to have made a significant discovery that could alter the course of history. Rachel made the decision to stay overnight at the tidal pools in order to gain more insight into Catherine's spectral activities, and by 3:17 a.m. she was heading back out at first light to gather additional samples. As she glanced down at the tide pools, she saw Catherine's soul. But she wasn't alone. Dozens of ghostly figures were emerging from the water. Drowning victims, shipwreck victims, and others who had been woken by a low, melancholy wailing that appeared to come from the ocean itself. As Catherine continued her never-ending search, they circled her, their lips opening in wordless screams, pointing to the tidal pools themselves, the water glowing with a spooky phosphorescence, the marine life acting strangely, fish swimming frantically in circles. Sea anemones closed their tentacles as if to conceal themselves from something, and crabs scuttled out of the water. Suddenly, Catherine's spirit rose in the tide pool, her arms raised toward the sky, and the other ghosts faded until only she was left. She turned to face Rachel, and Catherine's soul started to travel over the water's surface toward Rachel, and for the first time, her cloudy eyes appeared to focus with intelligence and purpose. Rachel somehow understood what Catherine was trying to communicate as she got closer. Take a closer look. Truth is in the water. Attracted by an uncontrollable urge, Rachel found herself making her way to the edge of the greatest tide pool, where Catherine's ghost pointed to the water. Rachel glanced down and saw something that would follow her for the rest of her life. The organic material was pulsing with its own internal light, and Rachel realized it was somehow alive. The bottom of the tide pool was covered with human bones, skulls, rib cages, and long bones polished smooth by decades of tidal action. The bones were arranged in intentional patterns, all connected by thin strands of what looked like kelp that wove between them like tendons. Feasting on the calcium in the bones, Catherine's spirit indicated the glowing kelp, which Catherine had found before she passed away, an unidentified organism consuming human remains, and it was getting bigger every year. Impacting science was unable to explain the ecosystem of the tide pool, which was not only consuming the bones of the dead, but also controlling their spirits and trapping them in the tide pools to act as guardians. Catherine and the other ghosts were prisoners of this aquatic predator, compelled to entice more victims to satisfy its appetite. The glowing kelp was reaching up from the water, its tendrils wrapping around her ankles like living rope, drawing her toward the pool to join the collection of bones at the bottom. And suddenly Catherine's spirit moved between Rachel and the creature, her ghostly form fighting against the kelp tendrils as Rachel attempted to back away, but her feet refused to cooperate. Catherine's energy flickered and faded as she battled to save Rachel from the same fate that had befallen her. Run! Catherine's cry reverberated in Rachel's consciousness. Tell them about the thing. Don't let it spread. The battle was short but fierce. Rachel heard the thing thrashing in the tide pool, upset at not being able to eat its meal, and she hurried all the way back to safety after escaping the kelp's hold and scrambling up the rocks, her hands and knees cut and bleeding. Her car not stopping until she was miles away, and she came to the realization that Catherine's spirit had given her life to save Rachel's. Rachel used her remaining strength to break the creature's hold, but her account was written off as hallucination. 3 weeks later, when she returned with graduate students, the creature had disappeared. However, Rachel knew that the beast was still out there somewhere along the Pacific coast, continuing to feed on drowning victims and trap their spirits, and that Catherine's sacrifice had simply postponed the inevitable. The pools appeared normal, with no trace of the glowing kelp or bone collection. Catherine Blackwood's spirit may have found peace, but the creature she died trying to expose is still hungry. 9. The sandcastle. The creature would find new tide pools, new victims, and new ghost guardians. The tide pools of Mendocino appear tranquil now, but Rachel knows that the creature is still out there, growing stronger with each victim, waiting for the right conditions to establish a new feeding ground. It was a Tuesday morning in late June 2023, and Kevin Walsh was walking his dog along the empty Outer Banks shoreline near Nags Head, North Carolina, when he first saw the sandcastle, which was an intricate structure at least 4 feet tall, with multiple towers. At the time, he thought it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen on a beach. Kevin's golden retriever, Max, hesitated to approach the sandcastle, but he was impressed by how well preserved it was. No footprints surrounding it, no evidence of collapse, and exquisite features that stayed sharp despite wind and salt air. The dog whimpered and tugged at his leash, and as they approached, Kevin saw something that made his skin crawl. Dozens of tiny handprints, child-sized prints that formed a perfect circle in the sand around the base, were pressed into the sand, deep and clear, but there were no matching footprints. When Kevin returned the following morning, he discovered that the sand castle had expanded. I observed youngsters surrounding that castle one day, and the circle of handprints had grown with new prints around the enlarged edifice, which had new towers, longer walls, and even more ornate ornamental components. Kevin's investigation led him to Dorothy Martinez, who had a terrible story. "Morning," she said to Kevin, "maybe 6 or 7 children working on it together. As I approached, I noticed that something was amiss. Their complexion was greyish and pale, their hair was moist and stringy, and their clothing appeared outdated, as if it had been made decades ago." According to Kevin's research, a tragedy occurred in 1956 when 7 children drowned after their makeshift raft capsized in rough seas. The children were building sand sculptures as part of a summer camp program when they chose to take their creations out to sea on a homemade raft during a sudden squall, which caused the raft to capsize and the 7 children to drown. The storm that killed them ruined their sand sculptures. Kevin started watching the sandcastle before daylight, and at precisely 4:30 a.m., 7 little figures appeared out of the waves and approached the sandcastle. Kevin could see they were kids dressed in 1950s clothes, and they moved in single file, their pale bodies solidifying as they got closer. The kids took up positions around the sandcastle and started working in perfect unison, sculpting sand with their hands to create new details with amazing skill. Kevin took his 10-year-old daughter, Emma, to see the sandcastle. "It's not finished," Emma declared after studying the structure. They worked in total silence, their movements deliberate and mechanical, until sunlight came, and they all stood up together, walking back into the ocean and vanishing beneath the waves. They are attempting to construct a particular object, but they are unable to recall precisely how it was intended to appear. They continue to add new pieces every night because of this. The original sandcastle the kids had been building at summer camp in 1956 was captured in a photograph Kevin found in the archives of the local history organization. Most of the same parts were present in the ghostly version, but they were ordered differently, as though the children's recollections had been jumbled over the years. Kevin made the decision to assist by using the historical photo to create a detailed scale model of the 1956 sandcastle. He set up his model next the eerie sand structure on July 15th and bided his time. 4:30 a.m. As usual, the 7 figures came out of the surf, but they stopped when they noticed Kevin's model. Their pallid forms flickered with eagerness as they crowded around the reference structure. Using his model as a guide, Kevin observed the spectral kids start to alter their immortal endeavor. The students made steady progress over the course of several nights of effort. But as they got closer to being finished, they started to seem more substantial and genuine. Their lifeless bodies became colored and material, and Kevin heard them whispering to each other. Their treatment of Kevin was particularly unsettling. Before, the kids had paid no attention to the living world, but now they appeared to recognize him. They would take a break from their work to gaze at him, their eyes expressing both desperation and gratitude. The ghostly youngsters focused on Kevin specifically the night the sand building was finally finished. With happy, relieved emotions on their faces, they approached him in single line. When Kevin discovered what the kids intended, His pride at having helped them swiftly gave way to fear. The spectral kids that were all around Kevin, their tiny hands extending to caress him, their fingertips brushing across his flesh. It looked as though Kevin's blood was frozen by the intense cold. The children's expressions had lost their excitement. They were filled with longing that had grown over decades, hunger and desperation. With increasing dismay, Kevin realized that the kids wanted more than to finish their sandcastle. The life that had been taken from them was what they desired to return to. He had given them the drive and concentration to try something more riskier. By seeing their idea through to completion, the spectral kids started dragging Kevin toward the direction of the sea. Their hold was extremely firm. In order for him to attend their perpetual summer camp, they were attempting to take him into the ocean and drown him, just as they had been drowned. 7 of the ghostly children were motivated by 67 years of accumulated desperation. Despite Kevin's valiant efforts to combat them, Max, his golden retriever, who had been observing from a distance, came to his aid. Separation. The dog snarled and barked in protective rage. It abruptly lunged toward the group. Max stood with his hackles up and his teeth exposed between Kevin and the kids. Although the dog was unable to harm the spectral beings physically, his presence appeared to interfere with their capacity to engage with the real world. The children lost the firmness they had acquired, flickering and become translucent. Taking advantage of the distraction, Kevin and Max ran for their car. Kevin could hear the spectral kids calling after him as they ran away, not in rage, but in sorrowful supplication. They wanted him to return so he could assist them with more tasks and act like a grown-up. Oversight that they had not had. Kevin never went back to that area of the beach again. Even after relocating his family to a location distant from the ocean, he still had dreams about the spectral kids and their frantic need for company. Every night, the sand castle still makes an appearance on the Outer Banks shore, but it is now joined by other, more intricate sand masterpieces. A whole sand city, complete with homes, schools, and playgrounds, is being constructed by the kids. From the 1956 disaster, risky to help realize, people who are aware of the truth about the Sandcastle kids avoid the beach after dark. 10 The Galveston seaweed harvest. When Maria Santos first saw the elderly woman gathering seaweed, she assumed it was simply another strange beach vendor. The time was 6:15 a.m. In 2023, Maria was jogging on a steamy August morning. She was walking along Galveston Island's shoreline when she spotted a stooped figure among the seaweed stacks, working meticulously, wearing a faded black dress. The woman looked to be in her 70s. She examined each piece of seaweed with great care, wearing a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over her face. The woman's hands caught Maria's attention. As though she had been using ink, they were blackly discolored. Under her pale skin, the stains formed dark patterns that resembled veins and spread up her arms. Keeping a safe distance, Maria yelled out, "Good morning." The female Maria gasped as she gently raised her head. The old woman's eyes were black, yet her face was emaciated and heavily lined. The whole visible part, not just the pupils, as though they were filled with black water. Her hands were black, and so were her mouth. And as Maria grinned, could see the seaweed covering her teeth. The mother said, "Good morning, child," in a voice that resembled waves washing over pebbles. "The harvest is particularly good today. The sea has been generous with her gifts." Maria had never seen a strand of seaweed like the one the woman held out. It was nearly black, deep purple, and seemed to beat to its own internal beat. The seaweed seemed to move in the woman's hands as Maria stared, encircling her fingers as though it were a live thing. She replied, "This comes from the deep places where the old things sleep," as she stared at Maria with her black eyes. "Avoid the water when the seaweed turns black." Maria sprinted the remaining distance to her vehicle. Her heart was racing with fear. Except for a heavy burn lines in the sand where the woman had been working, the beach was deserted when she returned. The following morning, Maria's investigation brought her to the Galveston Historical Society, where she described the woman to curator Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, whose face went white. The gentle voice of Mrs. Whitman murmured, "You're describing Esperanza Delgado. However, that isn't feasible." According to Mrs. Whitman, Esperanza Delgado, who passed away in 1973, was a curandera, a traditional healer who treated patients with herbs and folk medicines. She lived close to the beach and was renowned for her ability to treat conditions that modern medicine couldn't explain. Esperanza continued to gather seaweed from the contaminated beaches, in spite of health officials' warnings, after a red tide struck the Gulf Coast in the summer of 1973, killing marine life for miles. She had claimed that the red tide was bringing special materials from the deep ocean. But the toxic algae had gradually, when they discovered her body on the beach, with her eyes darkened by the poison and her skin completely black, Maria realized that Esperanza's death had been no accident. She had purposefully exposed herself to the same deadly substances that had killed the marine life, the poisonous algae. Thinking it would finalize a metamorphosis she had been going through for years, aiming to merge with the ocean spirits she professed to serve. Maria chose to gather samples of the seaweed that Esperanza left behind, and the seaweed was different from anything she had ever seen. It was warm to the touch. When she looked at it under a magnifying glass, she discovered that the strands were made of organic material that looked like muscle tissue, not plant matter, and that they seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Maria had vivid dreams that night, in which she found herself standing on the ocean floor, encircled by enormous underwater cities, inhabited by intelligent, ancient creatures that had never seen sunlight, their forms combining elements of sea life with something far more sinister. Esperanza was present in the dream, but she was no longer human. Her body had been her eyes were the black unfathomable orbs of a deep-sea predator, her hands were webbed claws, and her skin was covered in scales, transforming her into something that belonged to the deep ocean. "You have touched the gift of the deep, once. In the dream," Esperanza stated, "you are now linked to us. You will soon assist us in bringing the presents to the outside world as the harvest continues." When Maria awoke from the dream, her skin was tingling and her mind was full of information she had never received before. She sensed that the creatures of the water were there in her mind, and she realized that the seaweed served as a conduit for communication, allowing the deep-sea intelligences to affect the surface world. Maria was frightened by the knowledge, but she also had an odd one to go back to the shore. The seaweed samples in her home were beckoning her to return them to their rightful place in the ocean. At last, Maria was unable to resist. In the middle of the night, she traveled to the shore and collected the seaweed samples. Esperanza stood in the surf, her dark eyes gleaming in the moonlight, waiting for her. Esperanza remarked, "You understand. Now, as Maria came closer, you have been selected by the ocean to help with the harvest." Maria was left clutching the seaweed samples as she waded into the surf. She felt a sense of calm she had never known before, and the water was friendly and pleasant. The seaweed in her hands pulsed faster as she went deeper, and she could hear the deep-sea creatures' calls calling to her. The change started out slowly. At this point, Maria's eyes darkened and her complexion turned grey. The closer she became to the water intelligences, the less she felt connected to the human world. Like tender embraces from longtime companions, the seaweed encircled her arms and legs. Maria became the most recent addition to this old scheme. She discovered how to recognize the unique seaweed that originated from the deep locations and to get it ready to be distributed to gullible people. Both Maria and Esperanza are visible today on Galveston's beaches, collaborating together. The deep one's gifts, they seem like typical women to casual spectators, but those who pay great attention can spot the indications of their change. The skin that darkens, the movements are too smooth to seem completely human, and the eyes are dark. The seaweed harvest is still ongoing, and the deep-sea intelligence's impact is gradually spreading through the human race. The strategy is systematic and patient, just like the animals that created it. Galveston's beaches appear serene and welcoming. However, those who are familiar with the truth see that something hungry and old is at work just below the waves. Not all seaweed that washes up on the beach is what it seems.